Hey everybody, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. This video is a big one. There's not a lot of code in it, but there's a lot of philosophy in it. We're going to talk about drawing things relative to the size of the J-frame, and I want to emphasize why this is so important. This is going to be the first time that we are going to really work with variables. This is going to be the first time we'll really start to think about things in terms of where they are in relation to other things. And we're also going to deal with a concept of abstraction. This is going to become extremely important in a few weeks when we start working with methods. Let's dig right into it. I have this JFrame class called Drawing Relative. So public class Drawing Relative extends JFrame. I've got my main method. We're doing all the stuff that a main method does, like always. Instantiating the object, setting the size, default close operation, and visible. Nothing different. If you don't know what any of that stuff does, maybe you need to go back and rewatch some of those other videos where I explained it in the first 5 videos in depth. We've got our paint method. Paint method, also nothing new. We've looked at that for quite a few videos now. Public void paint graphics G. In another video, in the font practice video, I talked about anti-aliasing. I'm going to go over to that font practice video or file, and I'm just going to copy my anti-aliasing stuff. Maybe you can do that too. Go back to Drawing Relative, and I'm going to paste it in right here. Start doing our anti-aliasing. Call up to the super, graphics 2D, G2D gets G, cast up to graphics 2D. My graphics 2D object, we're setting the rendering hints using that method and passing in these 2 arguments, rendering hints key anti-aliasing and rendering hints value anti-alias on. If you're watching these videos in a different order and you haven't watched font practice 1 yet, you might want to go back and watch that to get an explanation of what this does. If you are going to just skip that for now, pause the video, type all this stuff out so that you have it, and just know that our graphics from here on out are going to be anti-aliased. Alright, now let's get on to the actual code. I'm going to run this so you can see what it does. It simply draws a rectangle with a circle inside of it. Everything's anti-aliased, so everything looks really smooth. And you'll notice that when I make my frame bigger and smaller, that drawing also gets bigger and smaller with the frame. This is new. We have not done this before. Normally we've just set our stuff to absolute sizes. If we made the frame bigger and smaller, those things would stay where they are and they'd stay the same size. Well, I'm drawing these things relative to the size of the frame. Alright, well, how do we know the size of the frame? JFrame has a couple of fields. In other words, there are variables in that frame class that we can retrieve through getter methods. We can get the width and get the height, and they're both integers. Okay? So you've got these methods, get width and get height. I didn't write these methods. These methods come directly from the JFrame class. And what they do when they're called, when this method is invoked, it's going to retrieve the width value from the frame. So it's going to inspect how wide that frame is, and it's going to get it, and it's going to return it. Well, we're going to catch that return in a variable of type int. So I've created a variable, int frame w, which is my frame width. And I'm going to assign it the value get width. So it'll retrieve the width, store it in frame w of type int. I can do the same thing with height. Frames also have height. So I'm going to retrieve the height, store it in a variable called frame h. And this is going to be the top level of my whole setting things relative algorithm. Okay? Well, we set the size right here, 600 by 600. If I set the size bigger, set it to 800, the frame is going to get larger. As you can see, it got a lot larger. And you notice that our rectangle stretched vertically. It was a square before, but now it's taller than it is wide. If I go back to 600 by 600, you'll see that my frame is a square, like that, and my rectangle and circle here are square and circle versus oval and rectangle. Okay? So that top level where I'm retrieving the height and width is going to control everything on down below. We can see those effects cascade on down. Now let's take a look at how that works. All right, so what I want to eventually do is just have a variable called x, a variable called y, a variable called w, and a variable called h. X and y are going to set the x and y origin of my rectangle and oval. W and h are going to control the width and height. Now what I want to do is I want to center those things, and I want them to be have a size that's set in relation to the size of the frame. So here I'm getting the width and height, and here what I'm doing is setting the W and H. W and H variables are used to set the width and the height of my oval and rectangle that I'm filling and drawing to the screen. And here I'm doing a little arithmetic statement that is taking the frame width, which is whatever the width is. If it's 600, it's 600. If it's 400, it's 400. And I'm dividing it by 3. So we start out with our defaults of our frame set to 600 wide. It's going to divide that by 3. So 200 will be held in W. I'm going to do the same thing with frame H and store that in H. So I'm taking the height of the frame and the width of the frame and dividing them by 3 and storing them in these new variables. So width and height of whatever I'm drawing is going to be 1/3 the width and height of the frame. Okay? Let's say I change these. If I set this to 5, make it 20% the width of the frame, you'll see that our drawings are going to be smaller than they were. See, they're a lot smaller. They take up less space. You may recall that it was a bit wider before and a bit taller before. They were 1/3 of the size of the frame. Now they're smaller. I could set them to half the size of the frame. And you can see how this is controlling the height and width of our drawings. Bigger, much bigger. Because, once again, where we are filling our rectangle and oval, we're using that width and we're using that height variable. What variables do is they store information. And if you put an integer in that, wherever you want to use an integer, whatever requires an integer, you could just put it. Normally we've been hard coding this. We've been doing this, like 200, 200. Well, we're going to start using variables from here on out, and we're going to see less and less of this kind of hard coding. All right, so I've set the width and height, which are going to be used in the width and height of the things that we draw. Now, if you think back to a previous video, if we wanted to have things centered on the frame, we had to create an offset. We had to subtract a certain value from our X and Y origin so that it shifts it off to the left and shifts it up a little. Because remember, if we just set the X and Y here to whatever the center of the frame is, so let's say that the center of the frame was going to be 300 and 300 because our frame is 600 by 600. If I do that, if I set these to 300 and 300, the upper left-hand corner of my rectangle is going to be on center. So the rectangle gets shifted down. Well, if I want this rectangle to have its center on center of the frame, I have to figure out how wide that rectangle is, and I need to subtract from the X and Y, thereby shifting them up and to the left. So if my rectangle is 300 by 300, and I want its center to be on the center of the frame, I have to figure out how wide the rectangle is, and I have to divide it by 2. Okay? So 300 is the width of that rectangle. If it's at 300 and 300, I'm going to then divide this by 2, so 150 and 150, thereby taking my origin and shifting it up half the width and height. That'll put the center on the center of the frame. We saw this in previous videos. I'm not going to belabor this any further. If you need to look back at how all this is done, go back to those videos where we talk about setting things on center on the frame. All right, I'm going to put this back to X and Y, because I'm going to do those calculations setting the X and Y with the offsets up here. All right, here's where I'm figuring out what my offset is going to be. I'm going to take the width of my object that I'm drawing, and I'm going to divide it by 2. Okay? That's going to tell me how much I'm going to subtract from where the x and y origins are going to be. I'm going to do the same with the y offset. Okay? Take my height, divide it by 2, and store it in there. So these are going to be those offsets. These are the things that I'm going to use to shift my rectangle up and to the left so it draws the center of the rectangle onto the center of the frame. Next step, I need to actually assign values into my x and y because we're not quite done yet. What I have to do then is find the center of the frame, which is where my origin is going to be, and shift it to the left and shift it up so that the center of the things I'm drawing is on center. So frame width and frame height, those are these things here. Remember, we got the width of the frame, got the height of the frame. Well, we need to figure out where the center of the frame is, so what we do is we divide that by 2. Take the frame width and divide it by 2. If the frame width is 600, divide that by 2, it gives us 300. If frame width is 600, and we set our width to half the size, this would be 300 right here. Divide that by 2, this becomes 150. I'm going to subtract 150 from frame width divided by 2. So that would be at 150 over. See how this is working? We're using these variables to control things from the top all the way on down. And this is what's going to set our x. We're going to do the same with y. Frame h, which is our height, divide it by 2, so we know where the center is vertically. Then we subtract our y offset, which is going to shift it up half the height of the shape that we want to draw. Now, from the top all the way on down, these things are going to be controlled. If I set the height and width here to 750 by 750, our program is going to retrieve the height. It's going to divide it by some value, in this case divide it by 2 for the size of this thing. It's going to find the center of the frame, and it's going to calculate an offset and shift all our things to the left and shift them up. And whatever I set this size here to, everything also is going to change relative to this. The frame gets smaller, the drawing gets smaller. All right? So there you have it, folks. This is drawing things relative. Thanks for watching.